Yep. One more. Okay.
Oh, good morning, Thirst. This is just my daily routine. Which it starts with a lot of hot chocolate, which starts with a lot of Bible reading and hot chocolate. So let's go ahead and go to Acts chapter 14. Taylor did an amazing job yesterday of just pointing us to the scriptures, reading, giving us some applications, specifically in thinking through who Jesus is in light of the Old Testament. And Paul comes back to this over and over and over again, that Jesus is the center of the Old Testament. He is the one who provides salvation. So go to chapter 14, verse 1. I'm going to read this, and I want you to look specifically for the reactions that people have to the gospel spreading. And I also want you to recognize that God is at work in the gospel, that the church ought to continuously proclaim the gospel despite the outcome, whether it's positive or negative. So chapter 14, verse 1. Now at Iconium, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. So this is encouraging. John Mark had abandoned ship and gone back to Jerusalem for the sake of the difficulty of continuing to preach the gospel. And now they're continuing. This seems encouraging, but verse 2, the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Now, this is very discouraging, but notice the apostles' reaction. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel. And this is the key point that I want us to take away, that the church's main mission and goal is to preach the gospel, to proclaim who Jesus is, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's our goal and our desire, no matter where we are and no matter what kind of a result might happen. I want you to notice in verse 7, this phrase, there they continued to preach the gospel. You notice that their main aim and their focus is not distracted. And even further than that, when they face persecution and difficulty, when the Jews are stirring up the Gentiles and poisoning their minds, they actually stay longer in that place. They stay as long as they possibly can to preach the gospel for the sake of the nations, that many people might come to glorify God. So I want us to think about this, that the whole Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, is God-centered, that the church's proclamation ought to be Jesus-centered. And I want to ask this reflection question, like, is your life Jesus-centered? Is he the main person, the main thought, the main consideration in your life? And I want you to think about 3 different areas of your life. First, family. Second, school life. And then maybe extracurriculars. Is Jesus at the center of all 3 of these areas? So first, your family. Do you find that Jesus is at the center of your family relationships? Do you see him as primarily working between you as siblings? Do you see him in loving your neighbor as yourself? Recently, I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about how our siblings, our parents, are our nearest neighbors. And John says in 1 John, if you can't love your brother who you can see, how can you love God who you can't see? Jesus ought to be the center of our family life. And second, is Jesus the center of your school life? Now, and that means Jesus being the one who is ultimately the author of the outcome of all of your performance. So is Jesus at the center of your academics? Are you seeing all things, as Ephesians talks about, united in one person, that is Christ, that Jesus is uniting all things in himself? Are all of your academic endeavors ultimately pointing to Jesus, or are they pointing to self? And last, maybe you can see this most clearly through your extracurriculars or sports. We can use sports as the playground for our own self-exaltation. We can be pointing to ourselves in all of our different areas of life, but specifically in sports, this is a temptation. Is Jesus the most glorious person in your sports performance, or in any other extracurriculars, whether it's robotics, whether it's archery, whatever it is that you're doing on a daily basis, are you pointing to Jesus in all of those things, who is the sufficiency and the greatness of those things? And now tomorrow, we're going to be talking about how God is the creator of all things and sustainer of all things. He is the center of all things. And we can see that through the Old Testament. We can also see that through creation. So stick with us for next time. We'll talk about how God can be seen as not only the center of the Old Testament, New Testament, and our lives, but of all of creation. We'll see you next time. If you would, just go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Acts. Oh. Hey, Thirst.
At the very first one, I was furious. I almost said, "Stir it, stir it. Why don't you stir it?" Wait, listen. I told you we're gonna handle about 3 more things until we're all just going home. Couldn't believe you took your hot chocolate out of your fake fridge and put hot chocolate in it and went to stir it. That's all we needed for you to do is to stir it. Like our souls needed that.